At long last, we're going to create the interactions between the sprites so that our program starts to play like a game. At this point, there are two types of interactions we're looking at. The first is going to be the interaction between the player and the asteroids. The second will be the interaction between the lasers and the asteroids. The first type of collision is between a single sprite and a group of sprites, whereas the second is a collision between two groups of sprites. Depending on the type of interaction we're looking at, we'll need a different function. For collisions between the spaceship and the asteroids, we will use the spritecollide command. This is for collisions between a single sprite and a sprite group. The spritecollide command takes three parameters: a sprite group, and a true or false. If there are collisions, this will return a list of sprites in the group that collided with the solo sprite. We're going to need that list in a little bit, and so we'll set this equal to a variable. The true or false determines whether to kill the sprites in the collision. In this case, we want the asteroid to disappear upon contact, and so we'll set this to true. What should happen after the asteroid hits the player? That should destroy the player and the game should end. This if statement captures that behavior. This is a crude way to end the game, but it works. Later on, we'll make this function a bit less abruptly. For lasers hitting asteroids, we're asking the question of whether any laser is hitting any asteroid. This is a question about groups of sprites and not individual sprites. It's very similar to the spritecollide command, except it's checking for any collisions between the groups. In this case, there are 4 arguments. The first 2 arguments are the groups that are potentially colliding, and the last 2 arguments determine whether we want to destroy the sprites that collide. In our case, we want them both to disappear, so we set them both to true. The output of this command is technically a sprite dictionary, but we can informally think of it as just a list of collision objects. If there are no collisions, then this returns nothing. Right now, this part of the code is empty, which means that the sprites are just going to disappear. In a future video, we're going to add some explosions. If we play the game like this, it will feel pretty good up to a point. The lasers hit the asteroids correctly, but you might notice that the asteroids seem to kill the player even if they don't quite touch each other. What's happening is that the spritecollide command is checking to see if the rectangles collide. But because of the triangular shape of the spaceship, the top corners of the rectangle create collisions even though the graphics don't show it. We can fix this by introducing a different type of collision. Rather than looking for the rectangles to collide, we can use a circle collision. This means that the two objects will have collided if circles drawn at the centers of each rectangle collided. And we can control the size of those hitboxes by adjusting the radius of each circle. Through some experimentation, I found that for my graphics, a radius of 40% of the width of the rectangle has worked well. It creates a lot of close calls where the player just barely escapes. If your graphics are drawn differently, you might have to adjust this. To update the code so that it has circle collisions, we need to add in an optional parameter into the spritecollide command. This last parameter is a function that defines whether the sprites have collided. The function for circle collisions already exists, so we can just plug it in. And when we do this, we'll also need to update the sprite classes so that each sprite has a radius. Once all of this is in place, Pygame will calculate collisions based on whether the circles intersect, and that will eliminate the phantom collisions. There's a Circles.py file that has an additional few lines of code that will draw circles on top of the sprites so you can see the hitboxes explicitly. You can insert these lines of code into any future script if you want to see these hitboxes again. At this point, we have all the basic functions that a game should have. We can move the player around, and there are enemies on the screen to shoot at. And if the enemy hits the player, the game is over. There are still many things we can do to improve the game, but the core game behaviors are here. Over the next several videos, we're going to add in some additional features to make this game feel more refined.